Historically, the most significant lure of the Peace River country was, first of all, an advertising campaign that was initiated by the Dominion government because they recognized, in the wake of Americans coming up from the South after the American Civil War and after Seward's Folly, which was the American takeover of Alaska, authorities in Great Britain and in Upper and Lower Canada began to look askance at what was happening out west, because you had what William Butler called the Great Lone Land up there. Aside from the native population, very, very little Euro-Canadian settlement, let alone people with Canadian sympathies. So that is one of the fundamental purposes of the Dominion of Canada, taking the colonies in the east, attaching them to the little colony in the west coast known as British Columbia, and calling it all one country. They had to settle all settleable and arable areas in Western Canada, and that included the Peace River country. So in 1872, when they're looking for a route for the Canadian Pacific Railway, two explorers named John McCowan and Charles Heretsky were the ones sent out to explore a pass from the origins of the Peace River through the Pine River and other areas to the Pacific Ocean. And when Heretsky and McCowan went up there, they were just taken with this Peace River country. Not that the area there is so beautiful or so wonderful, it's just that after traveling 200 miles through forest and muskeg and bog, you come over a hill and there's this vast open prairie land like the Grand Prairie, the Pouce Coupe Prairie, or the Fairview Prairie, or the Spirit River Prairie. It tends to be breathtaking. And what a wonderful opportunity it would be, they thought, for people to settle and make this a sort of a distant outpost of Euro-Canadian settlement in northwestern Canada. So the Dominion government picked up on this because they wanted to settle the West. And even though the Canadian Pacific Railway did not go through there, it was thought of very seriously by Sanford Fleming to extend it up there to take advantage of the Peace River area, but they decided on the more southerly Kicking Horse Pass through Fort Calgary instead, because they were concerned most of all, first and foremost, with settling the southern prairies with people sympathetic to the idea of Canada, because so many Americans were coming up from the south. So the settlement of the Peace River country was put on a back burner at this time, but it was still there in the backs of everyone's mind. Now, when the Klondike Gold Rush came along in the late 1890s, two things. First of all, it brought another influx of Americans up to the Yukon, which is Canada, but Alaska's America, and there's more Americans in Dawson, pretty soon, Dawson City, than Canadians. Ooh. And also, Klondikers who were taking the all-Canadian route through Edmonton up to the Peace River country. They weren't getting through to the Klondike, but they were witnessing all this wonderful farmland. And some of them, like Alex Monkman is one name I can remember, just decided he would stay. And others did as well, because the signing of Treaty Number 8 in 1899 meant the land would be open for settlement by all comers. And commercial firms like Breeden and Cornwall began to build stores there, working in opposition to the Hudson's Bay Company, which was the sole commercial institution up there at that time. And even in terms of railway development, there was in 1899 incorporated what was called the Edmonton, Yukon, and Pacific Railway, a railway intended to go from Edmonton all the way to the Yukon. It never came about, but just this prospect made people think that, well, that's probably a good place to settle the Peace River country. So there was always this government lure, which through newspaper stories, through promotional literature, was always there. Then there was the prospect of larger farms. From the 1870s onwards, when homesteading was authorized and initiated in the United States and then in Canada, vast numbers of settlers, as we know, began to occupy the southern prairies, carving out their farms, many of which would be quite productive. Well, the success rate was so good that by the turn of the 20th century, there was an overproduction of grain. And the result was that the prices did not increase, they declined. And whereas the initial 160-acre homestead was thought to be the ideal size for a small family farm, by the year 1909, it couldn't hold a family of any size. So throughout the West, in the States as well as Canada, farmers were looking for areas where they could get bigger holdings, more land. And so in 1908, the Government of Canada initiated an amendment to the Dominion Lands Act, and they facilitated a number of things. They made it viable that you get not only your quarter section, 160 acres, but if there was a quarter next to it that was carved up by a bog or a hill or a muskeg, wasn't big enough for a farm, you could purchase at $3 an acre that acreage that was productive in that quarter. Get a little bigger farm. And there was also passed in 1908 an act facilitating the rewarding of veterans of the Boer War. The South African Scrip Act gave every veteran of the Boer War 2 quarter sections of Crown land in the West, provided they moved on to the land, settled it, and performed the usual homestead duties. Well, a few of those veterans wanted to settle in the West, but provision was made for them to sell their entitlement to others who did want to settle. Well, you could sell your entitlement, but then the southern prairies, most of the arable land, is all taken up. But when the government in 1909 decided that they were going to settle the Peace River country because the Canadian Northern and the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway both said they're building lines to the area, they put a Dominion Land Office up at Grouard, and they subdivided, within the next 3 years, they subdivided some 27-30 townships into quarter sections. And then they permitted homesteading. And with so much land now available, groups could settle. A father who's not making his ends meet in Strathmore, Alberta, because his family is growing, could think, if I took a quarter section of land up in the Peace River country as a homestead, I've got a 25-year-old son here. Well, why doesn't he take the quarter next to it as homestead? And son number 2, you could take a quarter section of land next to that as a homestead, and then on. And we could manage that all as one big family farm. And with South African scrip also available, you could buy that through the normal land selling process. Any individual is given 2 scrips, which allows him 4 quarters. And if his wife gets 2 scrip, well, there's another 4 quarters, giving them 8. And if you homestead, that's another quarter. So bigger farms were possible. So groups began going up there because it was viable, because so much land had been surveyed and thrown open for settlement all at once. So the prospect of bigger farms attracted people there as well. So that all meant that from the period of 1909 through to 1914, that the last great extent, or the last bastion of prairie land in northwestern Canada, the last gasp of the great central plain of North America, as it were, was finally settled by agricultural settlers.